good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Indiana University School of Medicine Correctional Outreach Project's first speaker series. So we are thrilled that you all could be here this evening to increase your knowledge about medicine, gender, and the carceral state. We have had the privilege of partnering with the amazing women who created the Indiana Women's History Project. Tonight, you will get a chance to learn from their experiences, their work they've done within the Indiana Women's Prison, also known as IWP. Through this series, we will take a deeper dive into the complexities that exist as we merge medicine and the carceral state, specifically for the women at IWP. Over the course of the series, you will hear their stories, understand the why, and most importantly, leave feeling empowered to make a change. Without further ado, I would like to provide you with a brief background on the History Project and introduce our speakers for tonight's Setting the Stage session. The Indiana Women's Prison History Project is a group of formerly and currently incarcerated students who do original research on the history of gender and the carceral state. The IWP HP scholars have presented their research at national conferences like the American Historical Association and the Organization of American Historians, as well as local conferences like Hoosier Women at Work. The IWPHP is publishing a book in the New Press in 2022, edited by Michelle Daniel and Elizabeth Nelson, on the history of the women's prisons in Indiana. First, I would like to introduce Dr. Elizabeth Nelson. Elizabeth Nelson is an assistant professor in the Medical Humanities and Health Studies program at IUPUI. A medical historian, her research focuses on modern institutions of confinement, such as mental hospitals and prisons. Next, I would like to introduce Michelle Jones. Michelle Daniel Jones is a fourth-year doctoral student in the American Studies program at New York University. She is interested in excavating the collateral consequences of criminal convictions for people and families directly impacted by mass incarceration. Michelle's advocacy extends beyond the classroom through collaborations and opportunities to speak truth to power. While incarcerated, she presented legislative testimonies on the reentry alternative she created that was approved by the Indiana State Interim Committee on the Criminal Code. As a subject matter expert, she serves in the development and operation of task forces, think tanks, and initiatives to reduce harm, to end mass incarceration, and has joined the boards of the Worth Rise and Correctional Association of the New York and advisory boards of the Jamie Sisterhood, the Educational Trust, and A Touch of Light and the Urban Institute. Without further ado, I would like to pass it over to our phenomenal speakers this evening, Dr. Nelson and Michelle Jones.
So I got married, so it's Daniel Jones. I know it's hard to kind of keep the flow going with that. So it's an honor to be here. Elizabeth, you want to kick us off or you want me to start?
Can you see the slides? We good there? Okay, so yeah, Michelle, start us off.
Sure, absolutely. So as you heard a little bit about the History Project, it's a true collaborative project with many women participating over the years. And this collection of 12 women is just a smattering of all the women who have been involved. There are a total of 8 women part of the actual book project. 5 of us are out and 3 of us are still incarcerated. However, I remember the time when we were all incarcerated working on this collaborative project, which is designed to tell the story of Indiana's carceral institutions for women, including focusing on feeble-minded homes, Magdalene Laundries, the Home for Friendless Women, and of course, the Indiana Reformatory Institution for Women and Girls, which is now the Indiana Women's Prison. So, yeah. Go ahead, Elizabeth. Go ahead,
okay.
Elizabeth.
So part of what brought this collaboration together with the correctional medicine outreach group, this collaboration with the Indiana Women's Prison History Project, is the ways in which the work of this group of scholars intersects with issues around medical ethics, public health, reproductive justice, et cetera. For example, and we'll kind of go into more detail of this later today and further presentations as part of the series. But just as a kind of preview, the research that they've done on the early Indiana women's prison, for example, demonstrates that there's a long history of medical exploitation and experimentation that was done here in Indiana, and also, of course, more broadly, intersections with the eugenics movement and our state institutions of confinement from the 19th century going forward. So there's a history of medicine component to their larger project. And in addition to that, what they're going to bring, and so we have 3 speakers who are part of this project who will be each featured each week. They're also bringing lived experience of healthcare and health conditions inside the prison, as well as experience working as advocates, once on the outside, advocates for improving healthcare and living conditions for those who are still inside. So just thinking about kind of where we want to take you all today, there are some key kind of takeaways that we hope that you'll walk away with. One is just to think about these 2 terms, correctional medicine and their relationship to each other. What's the relationship between carceral institutions and the world of medicine? Because there's a kind of fundamental sense in which they're opposed, right? There's a kind of oxymoronic or paradoxical nature to the term. Because when you think about what medicine is, or at least what medicine ideally is, the role of the medical professional should be to promote health, to increase quality of life, to preserve autonomy, dignity, to provide care, right? And the carceral state and its structure and its function is antithetical to that. Carceral institutions are inherently punitive. They are producers of ill health, premature death. They suppress freedom. They are dehumanizing. So to think about health in relationship to that system, to speak of correctional medicine, there's a tension there. And so health professionals who are trying to work in or thinking about working in those spaces, what we hope to get you all to think about are the kind of ethical quandaries that are inherent to this intersection of these spaces. So health professionals often find themselves faced with kind of opposing logics or directives for action. But what that does not mean is that health professionals should steer clear of this domain. It's not a matter of, well, this is just a matter of, corrections and for corrections. Because of the severe, human rights issues that are involved, health professionals actually have a special place, a special role to play in addressing these issues. And this is because health professionals come with a particular set of ethics, a set of ethics that are hard won, that need to be constantly preserved. There needs to be constant vigilance about them. These professional ethics, values, imperatives are extremely powerful. The idea of putting patients and their health first, regardless of their background, regardless of who they are, what they've done, where they came from, respecting them, working to prevent harm, working to promote well-being. So these can be some of the more powerful checks that exist against the abuses that are perpetrated within these carceral spaces. Michelle?
So from a population and individual perspective, prisons perpetuate ill health, physical and mental, and they affect particular populations disproportionately. Black and brown folks, class and through in their class and sexuality, ability, like, are they able, they're able or disabled, and their gender. In particular, if you can go to the next slide, Elizabeth. And I don't expect you guys to all read this, but just kind of pay attention to the highlighted point that people located at the most marginalized social demographic intersections are at increased risks for or disproportionately represented in our nation's carceral systems. And I think that's something that you want to kind of hold with you when you're thinking about who is incarcerated. And so the origin story of these conditions is important to review. And I will be very brief with going over these slides here. So colonial practices in Indiana regarding crime and punishment reflected general viewpoints of ideologies of the United States. Colonials depended upon definitive class lines, self-policing, and non-institutional methods for managing poor people and people they thought were deviant. Punishment for criminal behavior varied across including fines, corporal punishment, public stocks, banishment, and the gallows for capital crimes, as opposed to incarceration. Maintaining people in an institution was not common and thought ineffective to reforming deviant behavior. And colonials, quote unquote, had little faith in the promise that men might reform or overcome pronounced deviant leanings in prison, right? So jails at that time were primarily used for those initially arrested or awaiting trial. Next slide. So who was being incarcerated? What was happening with this ideology about deviance and social control? Historically and culturally, a woman without a man, in light of patriarchal norms, was out of place in colonial ideology and remains so well into the 19th century. And so establishing this idea of women without legitimate men, they were targeted for ridicule and policing. Children without parents or who didn't show deference to parents were targeted for punishment. And in small colonies, designated persons without officials, various officials policed the social and cultural boundaries of what was allowed. And there was an emphasis on self-policing to eliminate group conflict. But in the next slide, by the 19th century, there's massive growth of the cities, and there begins to be a blurring of class lines and changes in ideological perspectives of crime and criminality. And people began to change their approaches to self-control, to social control. Self-policing was a thing of the past. Old methods of punishment and crime, like the gallows and things like that, were thought antiquated. So there was sweeping effort to make punishment for crime appear more humane. Incarceration seemed more humane than hanging and less brutal than whipping, was a running ideology at the time. So the concept that relegated the gradation of crime against the length of sentence, meaning the greater the crime, the more time you spent, first emerged during this period and continues to today. So within this change came a reframing of deviancy. Deviancy was once thought inherent in men and women, was now thought that a person committing a crime did so as a result of external circumstances and familial influences, and was therefore reformable. Next slide. So there was great mobilization against this deviancy. Officials, families, religion, everybody mobilized against this idea of deviance being reformable. And sociologist Kais Eriken says that society creates the machinery of control in order to protect itself against the harmful effects of deviation, in much the same way that an organism mobilizes to combat an invasion of germs. The message then for those people who were targeted for social control was that not only will you submit your sexuality and your being to the law, but you will not have any sexuality or being except by subjecting yourself to the law. So power was therefore exercised within the structure of sexuality to establish moral and social differentiation and punish any deviation. Legislators believed that a clean and pure system was needed to turn the tide of crime, as bad families and faulty organizational society have infected the unfortunate, and prisons as we understand them today was born in that moment. Next slide. So the first prisons that opened was the Philadelphia's Wall Street Jail and Penitentiary, built in 1773. The early prisons permitted various methods of corporal punishment, such as gags, submerging or throwing of cold water, whippings, ball and chain, and hard labor, which were thought to be tools for reformation in the public's eye. But within prison operations, secreted behind high and impenetrable walls, consistent and sometimes severe corporate punishment was actually about securing obedience and conformity at all costs. Often those costs were massive for the person who was in prison, which is why secrecy is a material factor in heterotopic spaces such as prisons. And when I talk about heterotopic spaces, I mean those spaces which are set apart for the hetero, non-incarcerated white male identity to measure themselves against. Okay, and so we look to the next slide where we get to talk about the state of Indiana and the women's prison. By this time, prisons function to control women's sexuality in different ways. They function to promote gender conventions. They exist to serve in the role in this area's political economy, whether it's by marshaling prisons, incarcerate people's labor, or idling that labor, or creating jobs. And those prisons have also existed to promote the racisms of the day. So you take all of that in context when you look at the dynamics that happen at the reformatory. So it is recognized as the first separate prison for women, public prison, I should emphasize, for women in the United States. Prior to its opening, women were held in the men's facility in Jeffersonville. It opened in 1873 with only 18 women in that coming from the men's facility. And so there's a conflict of the growth of or the reason why this other facility needed to be created. In the 19th century, colonial ideas that we've shown of patriarchy informed practices that socially and economically left women adrift without a man. Women without the protection of an adult male, whether orphaned, widowed, or without older male siblings, were at a great risk for sexual exploitation and ruin. At the close of the Civil War, this was a reality for so many women. And it was said that nearly all of them, the women incarcerated at Jeffersonville, had been driven to ruin by some great calamity. So with some, a reverse of fortune had left them in abject poverty, and they dealt their whole lives in shame in order to get a morsel of bread. And that's a quote from one of our sources. And so in our conflict, especially after the Civil War, women, prostitution, theft, and fraud became some of the only alternatives to destitution and death. And the reality is incarceration was often the result. So we get to talk about the reformers, or who we thought were the great, amazing reformers to the rescue. At Jeffersonville, women were routinely sexually abused by the prison guards, often giving birth to the guards' children at the prison. They were held in squalid conditions and often humiliated and dehumanized in games the guards would play with them. And Warden Merriweather charged the guards $10 a month for open use of the women. So sexual violence in this sense, and targeting of women and women of color in prisons is more than rape under these conditions. It is a strategy to destroy their sense of being of a people, as a person. It's also a means to declare women of color and women generally as inherently rapeable and inherently valuable. I argue that incarcerated women of various races, including the white women in our city, in our state at that time, experienced this sexual violence in prison, where violence was legitimized, and they had no agency. And they were declared that they could be inherently rapeable. So Coffin recalled during her first visit that she, quote, saw one baby we saw but a few months old, and it was the child of a mother who had been there for 2 years. We can reasonably infer that not all of these women were willing sex partners, and the prevalence of sexual violence proves they lost control of their bodies and experienced a degree of a powerlessness while incarcerated. So but then Sarah and Rhoda organized with the governor, Conrad Baker, to get a legislative investigation, which ultimately resulted in the creation of the reformatory in 1873. We originally thought these women to be great heroines. Both of them had come from, they were both Quaker reformers. They had both come from long service. Sarah served in the Civil War. Her wartime service was working with freedmen and women and soldiers distributing clothing. And so we believed in these women when we first started learning about them early. But as you will learn, just because you're a woman in charge of a facility doesn't mean that you cannot, and that doesn't mean that you won't be subject to corruption as well. And so with the next slide, what we learned is that there was a prevailing idea about who incarcerated women were that pervaded all of their interactions as incarcerated beings in this reformatory, right? So you got race, sex, class, and gender. And these are axes of domination in that colonial origins of natural deviancy and deviance through affiliation profoundly disadvantaged women convicted of crimes, limiting or removing their access to resources and opportunity, and literally affixing them with a taint. So the ruin of the taint opened the door for the perpetuation of greater atrocities. Circumstances like being arrested or convicted or imprisoned for offenses against chastity, decency, or public order carried that unique penalty for the 19th century female criminal as the quote unquote fallen woman. A fallen woman, particularly a gender deviating prostitute, right, was also thought to be a archetypical dark lady who knew too much and was dangerous, too strong or exotic or evil, one who resisted sexual purity. So we say the reformatory was just as bad for the women and girls as the men's prison for the simple reason that they enacted sexual and gendered violence upon the incarcerated women and girls at the women's facility. Though different from the men's facility, it was just as traumatizing. They used waterboarding and a technique called ducking, where they literally take the women's heads, take their heads and their hair and literally duck them under sinks to punish them. They hosed them naked. They slapped them and beat them with slippers. They locked them in closets and gave them bread and water diets. All of these tools of physical violence, this idea of that you must be naked in order to be hosed, this whole sort of sexualized violence was inherently wrapped in the way in which prisons are oriented towards violence from the very beginning. And so the primary failure is the assumption here is that these reformers' ideas of what a woman or young girl is what they believed a good woman and girl is should only be the standard by which womanhood is measured. Okay, and so let's show you some other pictures here. So these religious leaders taught women domestic labor, sewing, and religious indoctrination. Most of the women worked in laundries, and the goal for women and for the goal of Sarah and Rhoda was to get these women into marriage or domestic labor. That was the goal. And that's what their primary industries were. Okay, and then you can see the next slide of this is the irony room that goes along with that. And so that sort of sets up the overview for where Indiana sat in the origins of its carceral institutions for men and women in the state of Indiana.
Michelle has outlined in using the Indiana Women's Prison as an example and of an important one because it was the first, it was the original one. She's outlined the gendered violence, the policing of sex and sexuality, labor or exploitation, et cetera, that has existed since the origin of the prison system. I want to go in and add an additional layer, which focus on particularly racialized violence, which of course intersects, as Michelle has pointed out, with gendered violence. But in particular, the perpetuation of white supremacy by the prison system in the US, And I also kind of want to pull the timeline forward and bring us to the present moment as I do so. So if you look at the history of prisons, you also have prisons and criminal justice more broadly. You have intersections with slavery, racism, the kind of maintenance of this racial apartheid system that has characterized our country for centuries. So, for example, if you look at the pre-Civil War, the antebellum period, you have the origins of policing, police forces in these slave patrols that were, making sure that enslaved persons did not leave their situation, were not able to escape. If you look after the Civil War, the criminal justice system was very much mobilized to keep in place those labor relationships, those economic relationships that had characterized those plantation economies under slavery. So practices like convict leasing, if you're convicted of a crime, your labor could be leased out to corporations or to farms. And so that essentially, recapitulated some of those earlier relationships. And this, continues well into the 20th century through the Jim Crow era, and the way that, the criminal justice system was used to police the color line and ensure that anybody who attempted to cross it, attempted to assert economic power, political power through voting, et cetera, could be arrested and convicted of a crime. You also see throughout the 20th century kind of increasing scope of the criminal justice system, nonviolent crimes such as sex work, vagrancy, juvenile delinquency, these kinds of things, right, start to come under the purview of the quote unquote justice system. And so the system begins to grow, right? And it really takes off in the 70s in terms of the just sheer numbers of people who are placed into institutions of confinement, placed into prisons and jails. So this is the time of mass incarceration from the 1970s to the present, which is unique to the US in terms of the sheer proportion of our population that we incarcerate. Like right this second, currently right now, 1 out of 100 adults is in a prison or jail in this country. So the scope of this is huge. And this again comes out of, there are lots of dynamics in play, but just to underscore the racial dynamics, this is coming out of, in part, a backlash against the civil rights movement, right? So you have this notion of let's be tough on crime, which has a particular appeal for white folks who are concerned about the expansion of civil rights, desegregation, assertions of Black power, protests around issues like police brutality, voting rights, et cetera. This should all sound very familiar and relevant right now. So, and this is kind of the work that we are doing here as part of this project is pulling out these continuities, right? And so what you have is this kind of sustained ideology that goes way back about Black people as essentially criminal or inherently dangerous, right? And that gets mobilized in various ways as part of this expansion of the carceral state. You have more aggressive policing and sentencing practices. The police, get more technology, bigger budgets, and more mandates like initiatives like the war on drugs, right, which provide pretext for surveillance, following people, pulling them over, searching them, arresting them, sentencing them, right? So this is all happening disproportionately, of course, to Black and brown people. You combine that with economic abandonment during, the Nixon, Reagan eras. So we're going to not support housing, education, healthcare, or any kind of social welfare. And then when people turn to illicit economies, say selling drugs, for example, then they're criminals, right? So this is echoing what Michelle was saying before about, say, sex work in the late 19th century. What options were there, right? And so you have, I'm going to show this graph really quickly here, so you can just see the scope and scale of the rise of mass incarceration and the sheer numbers of people who are incarcerated in the United States from 1930 or so, and then that slope is steeply rising beginning in the especially 1980s. So to tie this in with health, right? So part of what happens here is you also have the kind of criminalization of poor health. And so one example you might point to is how substance abuse has historically been treated, and treated differently depending on who it is, right? So here this historian Matthew Lassiter says, since the 1960s, policymakers have embraced a public health strategy in white middle class suburbs with regard to substance abuse and a crime control agenda in urban minority neighborhoods. So, and I'm going to come back to this kind of public health aspect of incarceration here in a moment, but I'm going to pass it back to Michelle.
So Elizabeth gave you an overview of mass incarceration to date. And so what I want to do is take you a little bit inside the conditions of confinement. And maybe some of you know this information, or maybe you don't. But facilities, particularly, and I can speak for my own incarceration, I lived in a housing unit where it was usually a single room dwelling, a single human being lived in that room, that they crowded in 3 to 4 people to live on top of each other. These facilities are woefully overcrowded because they're packing in people and not developing infrastructure, safe spacing and housing. And that's why when we'll talk about this next week, the idea of social distancing under a pandemic in a facility was absolutely asinine. Because there are larger numbers, the funds and budgets to keep up with the growing numbers didn't fail to keep up with the growing numbers. And so what we found is that there was limited and or no programming available for a wide swath of the population incarcerated, right? Because the budgets have stayed the same, but the populations have exploded. This also provided opportunity for private sector organizations to come in to find ways to profit off of municipalities with budgets that did not keep up with the growth of the incarcerated population. And so what you found is that organizations like Airmark, for example, which is a catering company, received a grant to pay, received a contract with the Department of Correction where they would provide meals to incarcerated people for 99 cents a day, and not 99 cents a meal, 99 cents for 3 meals, right? And so that sort of attitude about what an incarcerated person is worth or due builds into this overall ambivalence towards our needs. All staff, custody, and even one another begin to view each other through this lens of criminality, which for some women then they take it on as their identity, and they unfortunately reinforce those ideas of the criminal inside and out, which further perpetuates the system. How does this relate to health? Overwhelmingly, if you have a significant health concern, you can put in a slip and you may be and you will be triaged. But maybe the level of your pain or the level of your discomfort is often not believed. This is particularly with regard to healthcare. I've seen pregnant women put in danger because the staff did not believe they were in labor. I've seen people walk around with 18-pound tumors that the state or the facility did not feel should be removed, that they didn't want to pay to be removed because that person's serving a life sentence. So there's great suffering I'm talking about from the lack of quality and equitable healthcare. And the response is often just take an aspirin. The takeaway for me that I would like to share, it is a huge problem with healthcare professionals begin to take on the mindset and the behavior of correctional officers and the staff who are already oriented toward dehumanizing treatment and the recriminalization of incarcerated people, right? Because you're already there. You don't need to then experience compounded suffering. And so with that said, and I can go to the next slide, that compounded suffering, somehow you are expected to deal with that compounded suffering and also figure out how to re-enter once you are released safely, equitably, positively, right? But the barriers to civic engagement and re-entry are then amplified by a lot of unresolved mental and physical healthcare needs. And so what I've done on this slide is to just highlight it, just some of the wide breadth of all of the collateral consequences of criminal convictions. And they're huge. So they cover housing and occupational licenses, public housing, grants, benefits, right to vote, hold office, be a public service volunteer, sit on a jury, parental rights to travel freely, to live in a home with family members who are on probation and parole. I've actually known women who could not live with their mother because their mother had been on probation and parole. And so this mother has their children. And so suddenly when she gets out, she can't even live with her own children and her mother, right? Non-citizens can be deported. People don't qualify for bonded positions, all the way up from insurance age, all the way down to your commercial janitorial positions. And of course, you're not permitted to carry a firearm. And so I want you to understand that these collateral consequences, right, literally block or hinder your access to a successful reentry. And you're carrying that burden with also unresolved mental and possibly mental and physical healthcare needs post-release.
So I just have, I don't know if is my video of you all blocking the screen, or you can see the whole thing. Okay, good. So yeah, I just have some data to just reinforce, underscore what Michelle has been saying. So incarceration perpetuates, heightens inequities in society, including health inequities. So the incarcerated population in the US is sicker than the non-incarcerated population. So like if you look at this chart, for example, this data is a little old, it's like a decade old, but it's still, I think, relevant. If you look particularly at the chronic conditions like diabetes, hypertension, HIV infection, et cetera, you find much higher rates inside prisons and jails than you do on the outside. When you look at the mental health numbers, these disparities are extreme. Incarcerated people are 4 times, 5 times, 6 times more likely to have symptoms of a mental health disorder, depression, mania, psychosis, et cetera. The numbers are staggering compared to the number of folks on the outside. But what this kind of snapshot of what it looks like, this comparative snapshot does not capture is this kind of, dynamic nature of the process. So people with poorer health are more likely to be racialized, impoverished, criminalized, et cetera, more likely to be arrested and incarcerated. And then those conditions are likely to either develop in prison or get worse while incarcerated. And if just thinking about it in terms of like a holistic public health, on that level, these prisons are porous, so people are moving in and out. So each year, 600,000 individuals are released from state and federal prisons. Another 9 million cycle through jails. So, prisons play an incredibly important role in public health. When a nation chooses to police and cage many millions of people who reside within its borders, the implications for everything else that takes place in that country are vast. I want to just briefly spend a moment on the slide. I don't want to spend too long on it because I know we're running out of time. I just want to point out some new research that my colleague in sociology, Kenzie Latham-Mintus, is doing, along with me and Monica Deck on the aging populations in the US and their kind of self-reported health indicators. So looking, for example, at older adults' self-reported depressive symptoms. So what Dr. Latham Mintis was able to do was to look at data and compare people who have been incarcerated to people who haven't. And people who've been incarcerated do tend to report more, higher rates of depressive symptoms, mental illness, et cetera. Women are more likely than men to report such symptoms, such experiences. But if you look particularly at women of color over here on the left, this was striking to us, and this is something that, I mean, again, it's maybe not surprising, but to see this kind of, graphically represented, just the marked difference or markedly higher rates of depression that you see among women of color who have been incarcerated compared to all the other groups. And so we're trying to put this data into conversation with some of the kind of new conversations around particularly lifelong experiences of trauma, which is a theme we'll come back to in part 3. So I want to switch gears here and kind of move into our last segment, which is thinking about the relationship between medicine and health professionals and correctional systems. And if you go back historically and you look at those relationships, those earliest intersections are often around medical experimentation. This is something that came up in our group's research. So our colleague Anastasia Schmid, who's going to be featured in part 3, part of what her research revealed about the early Indiana women's prison is that right when it first opened, like within the first decade, Dr. Theophilus Parvin was there doing medical research, including experimental gynecological surgeries on the women who were incarcerated there. So it's just right there from the beginning. And so, and in going forward, there's lots and lots of notorious cases of experimentation on incarcerated populations. Perhaps the most famous is the research that was done at the Holmesburg prison during the Cold War, where corporations and the military tested everything from lotions to chemical weapons on the skin of the incarcerated people there. So, you might be thinking, well, we have IRBs now, we don't do that anymore. And there are extremely important and effective, although not entirely, there's still loopholes, right? There are these effective regulatory mechanisms in place when it comes to research to a certain extent, right? But what I want to underscore and where I want to turn this back to Michelle is many of those conditions that allowed for these kind of abuses to occur in the first place, the stigma, the dehumanization around incarcerated populations, and the ability of corrections to deflect any kind of external oversight, that still is very much the case. So I'll turn it to you, Michelle.
Absolutely. Yeah, so thank you for that. So those of us who are familiar with the carceral state know that physical violence, sexual abuse and rape, inadequate mental health care, medical malpractice, denial of basic services, and the like have long been the norm of secretive institutions like prisons and jails. And we know that the state agencies charged with that oversight often fail in those efforts, those ombudsmen's organizations, et cetera, and that nonprofits and other groups might prove more effective effective in calling out routinely denied access to or care, right? But it's important to note that there are only 3 nonpartisan organizations in the United States that are external oversights. That is the John Howard Association in Illinois that opened in 1901, the Pennsylvania Prison Society that opened in 1787, it's the first one, and the Correctional Association of New York that opened in 1884. These are non-governmental, non-profit entities with legislative mandates to review, walk in, check in on facilities. They have limited right of access to facilities, which means that they have to give some sort of notice before they go in. They have limited communication with incarcerated people. They do not have golden key access, which is rare. which means that you can walk up to the building as an organization, knock on the door and say, let me in, I want to see. Unfortunately, these organizations only have recommendation power. In other words, they can identify a policy or practice or abuse and only recommend to the Department of Correction to make changes, right? So this ultimately, in some cases, dissuades people, incarcerated people, for coming forward. Why? Because prisons are secretive, cordoned off entities. And what happens to the women and the men inside is it can be known to these entities, these very few entities, but not necessarily create real change. For example, in the state of Indiana and other places, if you are a person who files grievances too much, files class action lawsuits, has a lot of legal support, you may find yourself subject to what we call bus therapy. Bus therapy is when you are kept in a state of constant disruption and unease and instability by being shipped repeatedly back and forth between facility and facility, facility and facility, to keep you unrooted, to keep your visitation list behind you, to keep your inmate trust fund information behind you, to keep you always in a state of disruption and peace. And it's so it is a form of punishment. This can go on and not change any policies, because all they have to say is that we have an overcrowding issue, we had this safety and security issue, we had this thing happen, we had that thing happen, and next thing you know, you're moved around. But with real power of an external oversight mechanism with golden key access to correctional facilities, we can get a better handle on the care that is lacking for incarcerated people, because there are people who happen to just be in a geographic location that permits them to leave. So they have right to care, right to access.
So I'm sorry, I got kicked off for a second. I hope we're back here. So I'm going to just end with a few things to think about and hopefully kick off a bit of discussion. So as we stated at the beginning, there is a tension between the logic of corrections and the ethical ideals of health professions, which can leave health professionals working in or with these spaces with what have been called dual loyalties, right? So physicians working for prison administrations may, for example, find themselves caught between the directives of the prison, which are all about quote unquote security, and their ethical responsibility toward their patients. One of the many examples, I might mention, of these is the practice of segregation or solitary confinement, which almost always involves some health professional signing off on, right? Now, prisons and jails use this practice routinely as a way of managing disturbed or disruptive individuals, but this is a practice that is extremely detrimental to mental health. It's basically the worst thing you can do for someone. Similarly, you might extend that to thinking about the use of psychiatric medications in prisons, which is more often than not used as a form of chemical restraint. So it's a way to manage the prison and the population rather than as a part of that individual's therapeutic process. These are practices that incarcerated people can be subject to for days, months, weeks, years, right? So being confined to a cell, something like 22 out of 24 hours a day. So, health professionals in these spaces must be willing to consider what they will do when they are asked, and they will be asked, to go against their ethical commitments to their patients. So what are they willing to risk? Are you willing to risk your job, for example? So I'm thinking, for example, of Dawn Wooten, so the nurse who was working at the ICE facility in Georgia last year, who became a whistleblower when it came to her attention that a physician there was performing unwanted mass hysterectomies. So forced sterilizations, again, things that we thought were the past. So that was the eugenics era. Here it is, right? She lost her job. She, exposed herself to death threats, et cetera. But she was willing to do that, right? So there's this kind of self-reflection of what where do you stand? What are you willing to stand for and against? But, you might be thinking, well, I'm not planning on working in a prison. But even physicians or health professionals who are not working in those spaces find themselves intersecting with these populations. For example, you might work at a hospital that receives patients from the local jail or prison. What would you do if a police officer demands that you release somebody into their custody and you feel that that is not in their best interest, right? So these are the kinds of situations that do come up. And then more broadly, we might think about how physicians, health professionals in general, can act as a political force, because physicians do have great authority. They carry expertise. And, how can physicians organize and use their voices to lend power to efforts like what Michelle's talking about, extending greater oversight, ending harmful practices like solitary confinement. So in this regard, I want to encourage you all to get involved with or learn about Physicians for Human Rights, which is, if you go to their website, they have a trove of information about the kinds of issues that we've been talking about. That's a wonderful place to start. And I know that our organizers today, Trillia and Rebecca, are going to share additional resources as well. So that's it for me. Michelle, do you have anything to say before we want to turn it over?
Just, I love everything that you said. And I think the last thing that you thought, it's like, how can health professionals and advocates promote health while also working towards abolition? The system needs to be transformed, and you do it step by step to get it to a place where the correctional system is no longer the way it is bolstered and puffed up in our society. And so how do we transform it to dismantle it? And what is the healthcare professionals' role and advocates' role in that? Because honestly, you are probably the only group that's going to go in there that starts with personhood, that starts with the idea that that incarcerated person is a person and doesn't have to be convinced of that truth down the road. Yeah. And so we're open for questions if people have them. I know we have a limited amount of time, but we want to give space for that.
Yep, and you can also feel free to direct message any of us questions if you're uncomfortable asking it in front of the big group.
Absolutely. Okay.
Hi, thank you so much for the talk. First of all, it was awesome to hear, and thank you for sharing your experience, especially Michelle. I wanted to ask, I know you've talked about this issue of dual loyalty within healthcare, within an incarceration system. So I'm wondering, aside from whistleblower status, where you sort of have taken yourself out of an advocacy role in a direct setting by becoming a whistleblower, if there are examples that you've seen of what people do well to work within the system, considering there are so many issues.
Right. So one thing that I've seen, and I'll never forget her, is Miss White. It's Miss White. Okay, so Miss White had also been there a long time, had gained the status of elder, and she would push back. If she would stay there and say, you know what, this woman is in her last trimester. I know that she's whatever you think she is, but as the medical professional in the room, I think she needs to go to the hospital. I've seen her do that. I've seen her show extreme care for a woman who was burned in the kitchen because the kitchen floor was slippery and she had severe burns on her body. Her going that extra mile to call the professor to get the professor to allow her to miss her classes, and that whole extra step to me showed her humanity towards that individual. I've seen it in different care providers, but I've also seen that other side where people are just literally I am a correctional officer in a white outfit and schmucks, and they are more prevalent than these beautiful people who are like, oh my gosh, how can I help? Here, take this, da 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 da. They're rare, but they do exist, and they hold to the oath or the truth that they are here to provide care, right? Yeah, I've seen it happen. I've experienced it myself. I was injured with table saw incident, don't ask, but in building trades. And I got really, and I'm a whiner when I'm hurt, and I was cared for. This wife, she's great. Any other questions?
I'm curious how Indiana compares to other states in terms of just, I mean, I know federal prison across the board is run by the US, but state prisons are individualized. So I'm wondering how Indiana compares. And with that, assuming that we're not the best, what states do we try to model ourselves after?
I don't have an answer for that last part of the question, but I think that we're very comparable with other states in the terms of using privatized care. That was a big switch that came in with the punitive turn in the Omnibus Crime Bill in 1994. There was a shift towards farming out that part, as many parts of the job of doing incarceration as possible. And so the facility wasn't any different in the state. And that's happened across the country, privatizing medical care, privatizing the health care, privatizing the education, privatizing food, right? That inevitably creates problems because there may be mandates in the statute and the law that the Department of Correction has to hold to, that the Indiana Public Health Department could hold them to. But when you contract out, they're not, those stipulations in the law are not covered on the contractor. It doesn't transfer to the contractor, and that's why we saw so many problems when Indiana chose to privatize its medical care, because no longer were they held to the same responsibilities the Department of Health would hold the Department of Correction to. Elizabeth, do you have any thoughts about states around the country?
Not necessarily with regard to healthcare, because that's something I haven't had a chance to look at. I mean, I do, most of my interface with prisons has been around education, and so I do, look at places like Pennsylvania or California and see some of the programming that they have there that seems much more robust and advanced, and I kind of, a greater in some cases, greater autonomy for students and for incarcerated advocates to do things, including make legislation and things like that, which I kind of look to as, wouldn't that be better? But I don't want to take up too much time with that.
Any other questions? This is great.
Thank you for your presentation. I just wanted to share that I'm coming from a bit of a state of apprehension, mainly because I know that the prison system is so corrupt. So as a future healthcare provider, I'm kind of fearful of becoming involved as a provider because I don't want to become corrupted. But I feel like, so I'm mainly fearful that if I even try to go in with this mindset that I want to help improve the care that prisoners are provided, that I will become corrupted by the system. And also, I just, from a question of just my state of naivety, as a woman, are you able to serve the male prisons? Because that's another thing that I honestly would be a little apprehensive about, but I'm also just wanting to learn. So thank you.
Yeah, there are female healthcare providers in men's facilities, and I do respect your orientation. I definitely do, because I think that most healthcare providers sometimes get into that bind, that tension that Elizabeth illuminated earlier, where that this person requires his care, but according to the contract that the private medical entity has with its Department of Correction, only these medications are permitted to be given to incarcerated people, even though you might think that that's less effective or not what they should be prescribed, you end up having to prescribe what it will be paid for by the Department of Correction through their contract with the private contractor. And so those kinds of negotiations, particularly if someone has had a serious surgery or other type of significant care, is a huge battle. It's a huge battle, but I don't want to dissuade you against it, because I think that more people who go in with the right kind of consciousness and then they find each other within that work, they can become a supportive network for one another. Because I've seen that happen as well, where, healthcare providers, the women who, the healthcare providers who stood up for the incarcerated person, yeah, you may not be the favorite of the warden or whatnot, whatever, but amongst the community of your healthcare, your co-workers, you are embraced and supported, and you end up supporting one another.
I wonder too, and I don't know if this exists at all, but because I'm thinking about this model, and so I can see why the private model is bad, because that's all about like the lowest cost possible, and
Absolutely.
But I also, I can see why it's better to have people who are working for the state and are held by the state standards, but that's also problematic. I wonder if physicians have ever kind of created independent groups that serve these populations that are neither the private kind of company or orientation, and also not working for the state but working independently. I'm just curious. I don't know.
I doubt it's ever happened, because those contracts are so lucrative.
Mm-hmm.
That they're highly competitive to grab, because you can think about it, they usually go 5 to 10 years, and you're going to get paid 5 to 10 years to provide healthcare. So they're highly competitive.
Thank you.
Anybody else? Oh, okay, there you go.
Okay, thank you both for making this such a really informative session. I know it was very thought-provoking for a lot of us, makes us kind of consider, why we're interested in this group, why we came to this talk, and like what we want to do in the future. So with that, I'll transition to like what we can do, and we'll kind of talk about this at the end of every session. And then we'll also share a little document with you guys. I think it will be sent in the chat with links, but just to promote the next 2 sessions, because I know that they'll be just as wonderful as this one. The next one, Michelle will be back. It's called Advocacy Today. And it's we're just going to transition to an overview of the work currently and formerly incarcerated people and their allies are doing today to promote health, reproductive justice, and end human rights violations in Indiana prisons. And so that's next Thursday at the same time. And then in 2 Thursdays from now will be our closing session titled Time, Trauma, and Healing. And Dr. Nelson will be back for that one, along with Anastasia. And with that one, we will conclude with a discussion about the medical exploitation and abuse within prisons in Indiana and beyond. And we'll focus specifically on gynecological and mental health in those sessions. So if you like this one, please come back for the next 2. And I think we'll have a lot more thought-provoking discussion, and we'll learn a lot more. And then because we're kind of over on time, I'll just leave it to you guys to kind of read in the document that I think Kayla is going to drop in the chat. And then we'll also disseminate this via our listserv. But there are a couple of organizations we want you guys to look into. And then Trulia, if you want to go to the next slide. We've also attached a few articles that are quick reads, but worth reading with kind of a healthcare emphasis. And then if videos are more your thing, there are 3 attached videos as well. And then the Marshall Project is a really cool blog, and you can sign up for their newsletter. I get it every week, and I always read a lot of the kind of editorials and personal stories about people's experiences while they're incarcerated. And then Locked Up and Locked Down is another kind of organization. And then lastly, we want to encourage you guys to get involved with our student group that we're going on a little under a year right now of kind of being established. But with COVID, everything has kind of been delayed. But in the future, we are hoping to send medical students into facilities to kind of get involved in correctional care, learn what that looks like, think critically about how we can make it better while we're there. And then in the future, if we are interested in that kind of work, and then hopefully by the time most of us on this talk are like our fourth years, sorry if any fourth years are on this, we're hoping to have an elective rotation where you can really go in every single day for a few weeks at a time and get that experience in correctional health. And then lastly, we are looking for first and second year representatives to serve on our leadership team. So if you're interested in that, please reach out. I will send our email. I'll type that right now in the chat. So reach out to us if you're interested in serving. We would love to have you. We love to expand our board. More minds is better. But yeah, with that, I hope you guys come to the next session, and thank you, Dr. Nelson and Michelle, so much.
Thank you. It's been a pleasure. You guys have a great night.
Thanks for coming, everyone. All right, thank you, Trillia and Rebecca.